Ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome, welcome. I know it says that this is the final panel of the Vienna Humanities Festival, but I see it as both the final panel of this festival and the first of the next, because the conversation we are going to have today is something that is undoubtedly going to stretch between now and then, because it's a theme that is on so many of our minds for different reasons. It's a provocative theme. What's the matter with identity politics? It's a necessary theme. It's a searching theme. It's a hyperbolic theme. It's a sometimes overstated theme. But it's one that I think we all, in different ways, inhabit in the context of the zeitgeist that we're all at some level enveloped in. And it is a true and unbridled honor to have three very serious authors, critics, writers, academics, and most importantly, antagonizes. Everyone on this panel practices what the old-fashioned Marxist would call praxis. They put into practice their ideas because they're committed through their scholarship, through their journalism, through their criticism of a better world. So to my mind, it's the best kind of critic. And so to my left, immediate, we have Gary Younge, who hails from the UK. Gary teaches sociology in Manchester, but he's probably best known for a raft of quite significant titles, the most recent of which that was published in the States only some weeks ago. It's been in the UK for several months. Dispatches from the Diaspora is a collection of his journalistic writings over some decades now. But perhaps most relevant to today, around a decade ago, Gary published a text called "Who Are We?" No question mark there. The question mark comes after, and should it matter in the 21st century? Next to Gary is Susan NEIMAN. Susan, as everyone here needs no introduction, but just let's get on with it, has published recently a very fine, slim volume called Left is Not Woke. Susan, though, is a philosopher, someone who studied at Harvard with the eminent Stanley Cavell and Jack Rawls, and all of her work, learning from the Germans, her previous book, her works on moral clarity, her works on evil, are all imbued with this philosophical bent and sensibility that is so much a part of her own intellectual project. And I'm honored, by the way, to be on the board of Susan's Einstein Forum in Potsdam. And to Susan's left is the inimitable and powerful KENAN MALIK. Kenan's new book, also relevant for today's discussion, with the quite felicitous title, Not So Black and White, A History of Race from White Supremacy to Identity Politics, is one of many books that he's penned on questions of race, questions of multiculturalism, questions of science. Strange Fruit, a very fine title by him, Why Both Sides Are Wrong in the Race Debate, I think will come clear again how Kenan doesn't just strive to take both sides of an argument, certainly not, but in the best tradition of the dialectic, he tries to take two views and sees what synthetic outcome can come of them. So this is going to be a superlative conversation. It's a quartet, as you can see. We had an additional string member, David Reef, who sadly is coming in late. He will be here tonight, so you'll have a time to see him, but I think having a straight-on string quartet may serve us best. So, with that, on with the show. It's interesting to me that the word woke, a word that is used to understate fairly promiscuously in the vernacular today, is a term that some embrace, some find repellent, and others simply have a kind of middling view on. It doesn't appear in Kenan's index, in his quite long historical and social theoretical treatment, not so black and white. It does appear in Susan's title. And to my knowledge, Gary finds it a unhelpful and particular pejorative term. But it is so desperately part of the current conjuncture. And it would be worth just beginning with asking, before we turn to a little bit of the history of where we are today, what is your sense of this term? What does it denote? What does it connote? What does it offer us? What does it do regrettably for us? And maybe, Kenan, since it doesn't show up in your index, you might begin asking or telling us why.
It deliberately doesn't show up in my index. Can I first say, I love Susan's book, The Left is Not Woke. And it's one of the most quotable books. I've been quoting it. It's just full of nuance and wisdom. But I need to say that first, because I also want to say that I'm very, very wary of the very word woke. Because woke, it seems to me, has become a means of marking out territory as opposed to having an argument or having an intellectual debate. And you can see that most in the kind of the anti-woke arguments, which is about marking out territory, essentially. And woke has become almost anything. There was some of you may know, in Britain, currently there's a debate about HS2, high-speed 2. Britain's so behind that the rest of Europe, that it's only got one high-speed line, rail line, and it's talk about building a second one. And there's been a debate over the past 2 or 3 weeks about how they're going to slash funding for it. And one of Britain's biggest tabloid described those who support HS2 as woke. It's kind of, and that's a problem. The problem is that or that's part of the problem. It's become relatively meaningless. And at the same time, the anti-woke arguments, the anti-woke movement, particularly in America, the movements for censorship, for the destruction, really, of many universities and university courses in the name of being anti-woke, is so problematic that I think the very term woke, for me anyway, is not something that I would want to make a lot of. Having said that, I do think that the point that Susan's pushing at, that there is a view and a set of arguments, a development on the left that is in relation to free speech, in relation to universalism, in relation to enlightenment and so on, that is deeply problematic and needs contesting hard. It's something I entirely agree with Susan about. And that's what, in a different way, I try and do in my book. So that's where I'd stand. I don't think this should become a semantic debate. What we're talking about are a set of concepts, a set of ideas, and a set of a worldview that has become embedded on the left, which is deeply problematic and which needs challenging. It's just unfortunate that the term woke has, to my mind, lost any meaning that would help us do that. That's what I'd say.
Susan, talk to us.
Sure. So I should say that Kenan and I are fundamentally in agreement on all substantive questions. And I got a lot of flack from friends of mine, some friends of mine, who said, oh God, Susan, I agree with what you're saying, but don't use the word woke. You'll be instrumentalized by the right. It's only become a term of abuse used by the right, basically to attack, well, whether it's train lines or any form of social justice activism. And I thought about whether there were alternatives and decided that there weren't. And I think that the impetus for writing this came, I had had a series of conversations with friends in a number of different countries who at some point would bring up a case of woke excess and then look at me sadly and rather depressed and say, I guess I'm not left anymore. And in one of these conversations, I said to a friend, no, you've always been left, they're not left. And so it's really this equation of woke left. A point that I disagree with you, I do not think that they're left. And I think the confusion and also the difficulty of defining the concept is that it's an incoherent concept, okay? Woke starts from traditional left liberal emotions. You want to be on the side of people who have been oppressed. You want to support people who are marginalized. You want to, if you can't correct the crimes of history or repair them, at least you want to remember them. And all of those are inclinations that I've shared all of my life. The problem is that they're undermined by a host of philosophical assumptions that people often don't even realize that they're coming from very reactionary sources because they've come into the water stream, stuff that you can read in your daily newspaper, okay? So it's not in itself a coherent concept. It's got a set of emotions, and then it's got a set of ideas insofar as it has a set of ideas, and the two work against each other. But so what was important for me, a number of people have raked me over the coals for not defining woke. I'll change that in the next, I'll say what I just said in the next edition. But I think it's a phenomenon that we all recognize. And the reason I didn't give a lot of examples of it is that I feel like, my God, I've sat in the last couple of years at so many, parties or cafes or whatever where people do nothing but bemoan one instance or another of the woke that I didn't want to add to that. My interest was to try to come up with philosophical, really very simple philosophical ideas. 3 of them that belong to both the left and the liberals, and a 4th that distinguishes left from liberal. At this point, I'm happy to have as big a tent as we possibly can, because I think the real problem is on the radical right.
So Susan, I would like to get back later to your kind of reclamation project for the left, but I'd like right now, Gary, if it's okay, to add an additional question for you. In your writing, you are not only uncomfortable with the deployment of this concept or what it signifies, you're also uncomfortable, if I read you correctly, with the use of identity politics. Your preference seems to me to talk about a politics of identity where identity is formed in the crucible of the political and the economic. And if you could expound on that, it would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, woke, the term woke to me is a bit like political correctness. It means whatever you want it to mean so long as you don't like it. And identity politics is not far off that. And the truth is that, for me, that there is identity in politics. It's unavoidable. We all come to politics with something. It would be bizarre to think that my politics would be the same if I were born in Bangladesh, female, 60 years ago, or if I were born white and South African 10 years ago. Like that, the things that we grow up with, the influences that we have, all of those things shape our politics. They don't determine our politics, but they shape our thinking. Of course they do. And so when people, and that identity is often the route through which people will come to politics, not least because politics has come to them through their identity. If you are oppressed as a black person, then you will respond as a black person. That's not all you are, but that we shouldn't be too surprised if the ANC get more votes from black people than white people.
If the ANC had what?
Gets more votes from black people than white people. That shouldn't surprise us. It shouldn't surprise us that the gay liberation movement is mostly formed of gay people, because they are the people who are at the rough end of this stick. And so unless we're going to talk, if our condemnation of identity politics as such is going to be consistent, then you'd have to count Martin Luther King in there, who organized on the basis of identity. You would have to count a large number of people who organized on the basis of Gandhi, who organized...
But Gary, machine politics have been around for a good couple of 100 years. Machine politics often organizing people on the basis of their ethnic identity. There's got to be something different now. Is there not, at some level, an exaggeration of a kind where particular aspects of one's identity, whether it's about race, whether it's about gender, whether it's about sexual orientation, have taken a place, a precedence, a prominence that they haven't before? Is there not something different now?
I think in every age, people believe that to be true. That in every age, you take the civil rights movement, then you get Black Power movement, okay, you've gone too far. You get the gay rights movement, then it turns into something, you've gone too far. That in any age, there is a sense of, or there is a fear that, or in most ages, there's a fear that whatever that thing is, let's take national identity. In the rise against colonial powers, there is a formation of a national identity. Right? We are all Ghanaian, we want the Brits out. Then at a certain point, there comes a point where it's like, we're all Ghanaian and we hate the people from the Ivory Coast, at which point it's a problem. The thing that I say in my book is that identity is an inevitable and essential place to start and a terrible place to finish. That it's like fire. It can warm you and it can burn you. But the other thing that I want to add, because it's where Susan left off, is that all too often we talk about identity politics only as being something of the left. Well, it's on the right in Britain that they are buying an excessive number of flags. This government has bought more flags than all the governments previously. You have the book banning and the librarian kind of baiting, and children turning in their teachers in America. You have Vox in Spain pulling down the flags of gay rights people. You have Trump in America walking to a church with the Bible to protest against the Black Lives Matter protests. That all of those things are identity politics. And so this is, and a lot of them are deadly. And so there is a notion when we talk about identity politics that we're always talking about black people and gays and women and so on. And actually, when you talk about the flag and the nation and Christianity and so on, you're also talking about identity politics. And actually that, at the moment, from the right, is where most of the violence is coming from.
Kenan?
I agree entirely with the point that identity politics is a politics of the right. That is precisely why it's so dangerous for the left to take it up. The first politics of identity, I argue, is race, the concept of race, which defines a person, their worth, their value, their sense of who they are, the way they're treated by their being, by their identity, is where identity in politics in a modern world comes from. I agree again with Gary to the point that it is quite often you want identity that leads you into politics. It was racism that led me into politics, campaigning against racism. But it was politics that took me beyond that sense of racism was all important. That my identity, my colour, my skin colour, even though what was being done to me, and Britain, 30, 40 years ago, was a very different place from what it is now. It was vicious and viscerally racist. But it's politics that took me beyond my sense of identity. It introduced me to Marx and Mill. It introduced me to Hannah Arendt and James Baldwin, to Frantz Fanon and Shivanandan, which expanded the way I looked upon the world. It introduced me to the Enlightenment. It introduced me to ideas of human rights and so on. But most of all, what it did was to instill in me the idea that solidarity cannot and will not be based on identity. The person to whom I owe solidarity and who I want to show solidarity with and who will stand in solidarity with me is not necessarily somebody who has the same culture, same skin color, same faith as I do, but somebody who has the same values as I do. And the problem now is that has reversed. Not that one's values define one's identity, but one's identity defines one's values. So that if you are black, or if you're Muslim, or if you're gay, or if you're European, or if you're white, that being that identity somehow defines the values you should hold. That's the problem, it seems to me, with the politics of identity. It fractures solidarity. It defines solidarity in terms of in identitarian terms. And once we define solidarity in identitarian terms, we've lost. Because the whole point of having a universalist perspective, a perspective which says that what matters is the same rights and dignities for all people, irrespective of who they are, vanishes. So it's precise. I agree with Gary, and half my book is about the identity politics of the right. But that's precisely why I'm so hostile to it.
So let's try to figure out, Susan.
Yeah.
What transcends then identity? Kenan was talking about some form of universality. I think we're all fairly familiar with 20th century notions of universality. The 21st century brings new obstacles. When we think about traditional class-based forms, they strike me as, in their own way, rightly or otherwise, a bit passé, a bit antediluvian even. Mm-hmm. So when we think about universality today, what would that consist of?
Well, Lenny, before I answer that question, I'd like to respond to both Gary and Kenan because, well, I'm totally in agreement with both of you that it's the right that mostly, uses identity politics. I really have to disagree with the idea that your politics are determined by where you're born.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
They're shaped, not determined.
Shaped. Okay.
That's a big difference.
I'm just trying to think. So many counter-examples appeared to me where the shaping, even I grant the difference, sorry that I misremembered, but where I just come up with counter-examples and I'll get autobiographical for a second because I want to make a wider point about why I reject the term identity politics altogether, because I think it assumes that we have possibly three identities, and all of them are determined from outside. And I would ask anybody who's thinking about these questions to take out a piece of paper and write down 10 aspects of your identity that are crucial to you. I was actually pleased that Kenan makes a similar point towards the end of his book, and even mentions a football club. I said this in a talk recently in England, and somebody came down. I said, I don't understand why some people can identify so deeply with their football club, but there are people who cannot imagine themselves as the same person without their loyalty to their team. But even on a question of what your nationality or ethnic identity is. So people think I'm from New York. I'm not, and it's actually rather important that I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, during the Civil Rights Movement. As a Jew, at a moment when Jews were just slightly a step safer than black people, but our synagogue was bombed because the rabbi worked closely with Martin Luther King. There had been Jews lynched in Atlanta, Georgia. And, does this make me, what am I? Am I a Southerner? Am I an American? Am I a Jew? I have people in Germany, both Jews and non-Jews, calling me disloyal and a betrayer of the Jewish people because I've been extremely critical in public of Israeli policy, okay? So, all of those things which were decisions on my part, just as the decision to take up a certain profession or, become a parent, or all of those things, are parts of our identities that we actually choose rather than that we're stuck with. So, again, I agree with Kenan that it's values on the basis of which people can shape I know Lenny is looking for 21st century universalism, and my own view is that actually there's an awful lot of it in principles that come out of the good old 18th century, if only they were realized, okay? And there are plenty of people who, simply, who are anti-racist activists. I'm thinking of somebody like Rokhaya Diallo in Paris. We saw at the last conference, or I don't know, maybe you missed it.
Susan, can I just ask, because you mentioned the Enlightenment, and I'll come back to universality. It strikes me that in your book, you have a very full-throated defense of the Enlightenment, but to some extent for me, there's also a bit of a exaggerated notion of what the Enlightenment actually represented. And I'm wondering, Gary or Kenan, when you hear about the Enlightenment pedestalized in a way as a kind of a particular historical moment to which all this identitarianism needs to be resolved by looking back at a period when the universal and the rational were held in such high esteem as they are in Susan's book. Do you at all blanch at that notion?
Can I just say, before I hear, I think I probably disagree with Kenan a bit in the beginning of his book on this score. I don't know about putting it on a pedestal, but I am trying to turn around what's become an absolutely standard polemical concept of the Enlightenment that people don't even think about before repeating it's a patriarchal, Eurocentric, instrument of domination, when in fact it was the Enlightenment that created the concept of Eurocentrism. So, yeah, if I go a little bit on that side, it was meant to be a short book. Kenan's is longer, but I'm trying to correct a very, very widespread impression.
Totally accepted. But Kenan, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with that point, which is that, in a sense, what Susan's book does is it's a polemical defense of the Enlightenment. But I'd also say, and this may be where you disagree with me, that the Enlightenment was not a single blob.
Of course not.
It was a period and a movement that was deeply divided and fractured. And there were those within, there were some themes that were common, and importantly common, including defense of equality, defense of universality and the idea of universal rights and of common human nature. But in practice, this is also the period of slavery, of colonialism, and nascent racial thought. And many of those who, Enlightenment philosophers who defended equality, universality, and common human nature, which is hugely important to defend, also denied all that to the majority of people in the world.
Like Immanuel Kant.
Kant is a complex figure in the sense that he changes his views, I think, over time. Susan might, again, who's much more of a Kant scholar than I am, might disagree with me. But what I'd say is that you had the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, a revolution built on that. But the National Assembly in Paris specifically excluded its colonies from that declaration because it wanted to preserve slavery and colonialism. And what transformed that was the actions of French slaves on Saint-Domingue, what we now call Haiti. A revolution that began in 1791, it began as a movement to reform slavery, became a movement to abolish slavery, and became eventually a struggle to create a new nation state, Haiti. And it was because and only because of that struggle that France abolished slavery. It first abolished slavery in Haiti, and then in Saint-Domingue, and then throughout its colonies. So the point I'd make is that those values are hugely important, but it was the struggles of those who were denied those rights, who were denied the rights of equality, of universality, that actually invested meaning into the idea of universality and equality. In a sense, what the Saint-Domingue slaves and their insurrection did was it forced French revolutionaries to take their own ideals seriously for the first time. And I think that's what we often forget, that we look about the Enlightenment as this kind of purely European phenomenon. In many ways it was. But the point is that it was the struggles of those both outside Europe against the denial of the rights of the Enlightenment philosophers often proclaimed, and of those within Europe, women, working class, and so on, who were denied those equal rights. It was in those struggles that the meaning of universality and of equality really acquired its form. And therefore, when we're talking about the Enlightenment, universality, equality, we can't simply talk about Europe and what came out of the Enlightenment. We also have to talk about the struggles of those who took on those ideas, but ensured that they really were universal.
Kenan, I think that's, if I could use the term, decolonizing the Enlightenment is a very important project. But I do want to hear, Gary, where you are with this notion of the Enlightenment as a particular historical project and what it represented, and the notion of universality, what it means to you today.
I think I'm just generally more interested in how it translates to now. And when I think of the and the way that it's evoked now, and when I think of universalism as a theory, and certainly as a state-run theory, the place I think of is France. Now, France is very determined in its resolution not to recognize race, you can't say how many black people are in France because they refuse to count them.
Laïcité.
Yes. Well, laïcité as well. So, and then there is universality of religion. We are all the same. We are all one. This is universal. That would be great if there wasn't racism. That would be great if there wasn't Islamophobia. That would be great if there wasn't sexism. It's because we are not all one, that we don't feel all one, that we're not treated as all one, that therefore people don't respond as one. And so, I mean, there's nothing much to, I don't think, among any of us to argue in terms of that for all of the ways in which we are different, we are all more alike than we are unalike. If you take race as an example, it's a construct. It has no meaning, but racism has meaning. And so when I hear professions of enlightenment and professions of universalism, I feel like, show me the money.
Yes.
Show me how you do.
Are you?
It's a very difficult argument to make when Marine Le Pen is knocking at the door of the Elysee, I think.
But can I just ask quickly, Gary, are you comfortable with the argument that is now made with increasing frequency that it's not race that creates racism, but it's inverse? It's in fact racism that inspires race.
No, I think that's true. That the reason that we have race as a concept is because of racism. That racism created race. That there had to be a rationale for why this group of people would not be treated as human beings. And so that rationale was, well, they're not really human beings. And we are still dealing with, and there was a lot of profit in that, there was a lot of money in that, but we're still dealing with the kind of, with the cultural fallout of that. There are a couple of quick responses as well, which because I agree with you, Kenan, that like, when it comes to the politics, you start with something, you start with identity, and then, but quite often, not always, and not only, but quite often, the one word you didn't use was solidarity, and that quite often solidarities are engendered through identities. Oh yeah, I know how that feels. I have a sense of that. That kind of my interest in Jewish history in Europe came out of my experience of growing up black in Britain. My interest in gay rights grew out. Now that's not the only way it can come. And that's not the only way that you can have solidarity, but there is also the potential of solidarity through identity. And that depends on how it's employed and whether it's just for you or whether it's for the world. You know, I think of identity as like gas that you put in your tank, then you've got to drive on the road with everybody else. And then, Susan, your point about kind of growing up Jewish in Atlanta and so on, and I think, well, people don't generally question me about my opinions about Israel. They question you because you're Jewish. They assume that you are from New York, and that would set off a certain kind of set of assumptions, maybe because you're Jewish as opposed to you coming from Atlanta. And that, I think what you described there was just intersectionality, that we are many things. I am black, male, British, straight, married. I'm a range of things, and I am one thing, Gary.
Right.
And that, but all of those things can be true. And that, you know, what you described was the constellation of things that make you, you. And when I say that we are shaped by our circumstances, I really don't mean determined. I mean that I have two brothers who grew up in the same house. We don't think the same way. Exactly. We grew up in the same house. But there are a set of things, there are a range of things that if they thought or said or did, I would be surprised because we grew up in the same house. And there's a set of things that they can't do because of the kind of house that we grew up in and because of who we are. They're not going to join the British National Party because they're black.
Gary, can I
just?
There are black members of fascist parties.
Just.
It's the rarity of them that allows you to actually say that.
Super quick. There was a TED Talk, God bless these TED Talks, that went viral recently. I'm wondering if any of you saw the TED Talk by Coleman Hughes on color blindness recently.
I read about it, but I didn't
very
see
quickly.
the whole thing.
Coleman Hughes, a kind of, I would say, center-left, black American personality, gave a TED Talk some months ago, but it's only now been widely distributed, in which he provides a very powerful and evocative defense of colorblindness, using the famous Martin Luther King, August 23, 1963, content of our character language. Now, to some, the use of colorblindness may seem immensely reasonable. But to so many others today, the notion of color blindness invokes something quite malevolent and wrong-headed, indeed at times racist. And so he gave an example in his TED Talk about musicians being tested for orchestras behind a screen. And he was asked later whether there shouldn't be some musicians, that it shouldn't be a total blindfold test of their capacities, because some people have not grown up with the opportunity to have Suzuki lessons and all sorts of training and the infrastructure that many others do, and that we need to recognize that color blindness in this way is inherently wrong-headed. His argument, by the way, or his rejoinder to that, is that we need to stay with a fully curtained performance, that is to say, a screen tryout, but that we need to invest in the infrastructure, and we need to invest in the cities, and we need to invest in this, that, and the other. So I just wanted to give that as quick background, but people react vociferously to this notion of color blindness that at one time was the mainstream liberal, a mainstream liberal principle. Where are we with that today?
I'll say a word about that, but I want to respond to both Gary and Kenan. Gary, you mentioned France, and I was starting to say something about what's been going on in the last, well, half year intensely in France. You know, any good idea can be instrumentalized and abused. And I think that's what's going on, particularly in France, the home of, you know, the declarations about universalism. And I've been talking at length to Rokhaya Diallo, who's one of the best known activists and writers and filmmakers, anti-racist activists in France. And we talked specifically about this, and she said, you know, universalism is a great idea. It should just be realized. She's not trying to get rid of the concept of universalism. She just wants it to be realized. And that goes to Kenan's point. Kenan, I fear you may be doing something that's done often by people who know less about the Enlightenment than you do, but you might be slipping it in anyway, confusing the realities of the 18th century with the things that the Enlightenment philosophers, the best of them, were fighting against. Yes, you're right, it's a complicated concept, and, you know, people disagree about who exactly counts and whether people could change over time, but I think there's a family resemblance that we can all agree on. Colonialism didn't start in the 18th century, and slavery didn't either. They took particular forms in the late 18th and heavily in the 19th century, but all of these people, Kant wrote the most damning critique of colonialism. It was late, but he sure wrote it. I mean, he congratulated the Chinese and the Japanese for not allowing colonialists into their country.
So Susan, let's fast forward to the present day.
Okay.
Content of our character, color blindness. Is there something inherently wrong with those assertions?
Yeah, because color blindness is just, there's something silly about it. I see the color of Gary's face the way I can see the color of his shirt, and it's silly to pretend, it seems to me, that we don't see color. Of course we do. We see all kinds of things. I mean, I would more tend to be I think on Coleman Hughes's side about let's invest seriously in infrastructure would be my point. I'm not going to let you go without my finishing one point about the Enlightenment, because I really do think that it's relevant for the kinds of political programs we're talking about today. People forget that the Enlightenment thinkers were left-wing intellectuals. Well, guess what? We don't always win our battles. Okay? But blaming colonialism and slavery on the Enlightenment is like blaming me for the war in Iraq, okay? It just... And the reason why I think that's so important is the one thing tying post-colonial theorists together and lots of other people is this rejection not only of the fact that the Enlightenment didn't realize all of its ideals like the rest of us, but it comes with a rejection of reason, it comes with a rejection of universalism, it comes with a rejection of all kinds of things, tools that we actually need. And now I'll shut up about the Enlightenment.
So Kenan, you had, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on color blindness, but you had a bit of a contretemps, as you often do, on social media this past week about a remark that you made with respect to Suella Braverman. And I'm wondering if you could just help flesh that out and maybe tie that into the other question.
Sure. Suella Braverman, as you may or may not know, is British Home Secretary. She's of Asian background. Her parents came from East Africa and migrated to Britain when Asians were essentially forced out of East Africa, Kenya and in Uganda. She's a right-wing, she's a flag bearer for the right of the Conservative Party. And she went to America, to Washington, to give a speech about, largely about immigration and refugees and the Refugee Convention and so on. And much of the debate around someone like Suella Braverman, and the context of this you have to realize is that the current Conservative government has a very high number of, a relative high number of black or Asian cabinet members and black, Home Secretaries, Chancellors of Exchequers, and now, of course, the Prime Minister have been either Asian or black. And this has led to a debate in which people say, isn't it terrible that here we have an Asian woman or a black man pursuing policies that are hostile to Asians and blacks, that are hostile to migrants and migrations. And isn't she being hypocritical? Because having benefited from being the child of a migrant, she is now being hostile and trying to prevent others from migrating to Britain. My point is that it has nothing to do with her ethnicity or her migrant background, and we should stop thinking in that way. That she is a reactionary politician. There are reactionary politicians. Anyone who looks at the world will know there are reactionary politicians within Asian communities, within black communities, as well as within white communities. And to link her reactionary policies to her skin color or her background seems to be deeply, deeply wrong. It kind of suggests that if you're a migrant or from a migrant heritage, or if you're Asian, or if you're black, if you're a minority, there is only one way you should be able to think about these issues. I think very differently. I mean, I'm not from East Africa. My parents are from India. I was born in India. I think very differently about these from Suella Braverman. But I don't think differently because of my skin color, or my background, or my upbringing. And when people look at somebody like Suella Braverman or Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, all they see is their skin color. They don't see their class, their education, the fact they were privately educated, the fact they come from upper middle class families. And so it's a kind of denuding of people's identity to see only that they are see them only by their skin color or their migrant background. That's not what pushes somebody like Suella Braverman to a reactionary policy. She's got reactionary politics, not just in relation to migration, but in relation to workers, to strikes, to the economy, to privatization, to all sorts of things. And her arguments about migration is part and parcel of that wider reactionary ideology that she has. And unless we realize that, then this idea that your background or your skin color gives you your ideology is deeply fracturing of the possibilities of creating real solidarity movement. And talking about, I know I've been talking a lot, but can I just say something in relation to a point that Gary was making, and in fact, which relates to your point about class as well. This point about solidarity coming out of identity. I don't disagree with it, that it can often become a refuge. It can often become a means of finding solidarity because you are so despised by other people in society. And that if you try and find refuge within people who have your identity, your skin color, and so on. But it's a real problem with this. And one of the stories I tell in my book is about a black sanitation worker strike in New Orleans in 2020. When, and anybody who knows American history will know the sanitation worker strike has got there's a long history, and very important history, of sanitation workers going on strike.
Martin Luther King, of course, was killed right after the
Memphis sanitation worker strike. And in fact, this slogan that the New Orleans sanitation workers used was actually taken from the Memphis I am a man slogan. Anyway, in 2020, sanitation workers strike in New Orleans went on strike because of appalling pay, because they weren't given protective clothing. This is the time of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and because they were denied the right to unionize. They went on strike 3 weeks before George Floyd was murdered. And the whole question of Black Lives Matter became the key theme of that year. They were black, but so were their employers, because as part of New Orleans' anti-racist drive, it had let out its sanitation work to a black-owned company. What Black Lives Matter meant was entirely different on the two sides of the picket line. To the workers on strike, or to the black employers who employed them and wouldn't give them proper wages or proper conditions. So anyway, that summer, the summer of Black Lives Matter, they were on strike throughout that summer, got a lot of support, rhetorical support, but were forced back to work that September, having won virtually none of their aims. The black employers won, the black employees lost. And that's the problem of seeing solidarity in racial terms. That Black Lives Matter talk about the global black family. There isn't any such thing as a global black family. Black solidarity based on identity, in that sense, is a fiction. And more than a fiction, the people who lose out most when we think about solidarity in identitarian terms are those at the bottom. Black workers lose out. The black middle class actually gain a lot from that kind of politics. And so I think it's important both to recognize that identity can become a means of creating solidarity because of the way the world treats you, but also to recognize why it is so problematic that it does so.
But doesn't that militate against using the word identity politics at all? Because it's really reducing all of our identities, our values, our politics, etc., to, this one category.
So Gary's going to, and then I have just one other theme, and then I very much want to open it up. So please, Gary.
So first of all, the point I was making about solidarities was solidarities through your identity to other identities, not within your identity, so that you may understand. I don't think it is a coincidence that a large section actually the overwhelming section of white people who joined in the civil rights movement, particularly the Summer of Freedom, were Jewish. That there was an identification that they could make through their Jewishness. So I'm not talking about kind of, if you like, vertical. I'm talking about it horizontally, which is quite different because of course there are, you know, within any one group of people that you can identify, there will be cleavages and fissures. I mostly agree with you about Suella Braverman, mostly, but I would say this, that kind of, I think that while it is obscene to say, how dare she as an Asian woman have a view that Asian women shouldn't have, that is ridiculous. I'm not sure that it is ridiculous to say, having been through your experience, can you not relate to this other experience that is so similar to your experience, which the person may say, no, because I think this about it, or no, because I think that about it. And that once again can be horizontal, that kind of Ireland, a country of immigration, of emigration, that there might be some resource there from the experiences of large numbers of people having family who have traveled because they were poor, that there might be some, not inevitable, not reflexive, but potential for identification, which I think is not an unreasonable thing to ask. It's a very unreasonable thing to demand, because people then, and that's the difference between being shaped and being determined, because then people can say, well, actually, no, I did have that experience, but that wasn't my conclusion. So hang on, my last point, which is about the color blindness, is that I kind of agree with Susan. It's just silly. Just because you don't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? Blindness is, among other things, a disability. And so when you're claiming that disability, you want to kind of be like, well, why do you want that? Why do you want that disability? And that kind of, if the cops aren't being colorblind when they're shooting people, if the bosses aren't being colorblind when they're hiring people, if the judges aren't being colorblind when they're sentencing people, then how comes we all of a sudden have to be like, oh, well, it just doesn't matter?
I don't think his point was the here and now. It's an aspirational question.
Well,
do we aspire to something? That's all.
I don't want to aspire to not seeing it. I have no problem distinguishing between things, discriminating between things. My issue is discriminating against them. Mm-hmm. So kind of seeing the difference in people is great. Understanding that difference as those people being better or worse, that's the problem.
And I think one thing that I've experienced in the States is that people up north, white people try to pretend to be colorblind, okay? And there's actually much less discussion, good discussion, of race and background and racial differences. I'm not talking about the people who joined the Klan, but there are a lot of, liberal, left-leaning Southerners in Mississippi, in Alabama, and I've been told by people from both black and white backgrounds from the South that it's actually much easier when you acknowledge, yeah, sure, I mean, you've got a different color, you've got a different background, you've got a different history. Let's not pretend that we don't.
So one last thing before we turn to the audience, and that's just the question of appropriation. And the term that we hear now insistently, stay in your lane. Stay in your lane. Spike Lee, the great American film director, was aghast that Sidney Pollack was considering directing a film on the famous American baseball player, Jackie Robinson. He said, you can't do that film. It's absurd. I'm going to do that film. Sidney Pollack? I can only do that film. Now, this might sound hyperbolic, but it has become part of the discourse around appropriation that we need to establish lanes for what we can legitimately assert and impart. Is there anything credible in those claims?
I mean, I've written a piece called Paul Robeson, Hero of Cultural Appropriation, because I think he got it exactly right, that the only way in which people are going to understand both their differences and their similarities is to bring them together precisely around different pieces of culture. Okay, so I find this discussion really bizarre. It's counter to the concept of culture itself. It's counter to the power of culture itself. The other thing that I never get is why Spike Lee can be outraged about that, but everybody's happy about Bridgerton. I mean, okay.
I wasn't happy about Bridgerton.
Pardon?
I wasn't happy about Bridgerton. I wrote a big essay about why Bridgerton was a problem.
Oh, where's that? Okay, I'll look for it. Thanks.
But Gary, your thoughts on that?
Well, here's the thing. I think that there is, historically, certainly, and probably even, I'd say now, there has been a problem, right? Black women write songs, Elvis takes them, Elvis gets rich, they get nothing. It's not like there hasn't been a problem with more powerful people stealing the work and the intellectual capacity of less powerful people. So the notion that there can be such a thing as cultural appropriation, I think, like historically, is unanswerable. So then you get the case by case. And I find, to your immediate question, the notion that white people can't make that film, or that, I find that sort of deeply objectionable and kind of a nonsense. I would also say that there are already lanes for different people, and that sometimes what we are talking about with this conversation is the number of, the number of times that, for example, on the BBC, the number of documentaries you will see about Winston Churchill and the Second World War, if you try and do something about the Caribbean, they'll say, we did that 2 years ago. And you said, well, yeah, okay, but no, we're not doing that because we got Churchill on then. Okay. And then if you 6 weeks later find that there is a Caribbean thing on and it's being done by the guy who did the Churchill thing, yeah, you get pissed off. that unless we are going to unless we seriously assume that we're working on a culturally level playing field, which we're clearly not, then this issue of cultural appropriation is actually a misplaced, very misplaced argument about who gets to tell whose stories, who gets to tell stories. Not who gets to tell whose stories, but who gets to tell stories. And that if black people aren't getting to tell any stories, because they're not going to ask a black person to do a thing about Churchill, right? They're not going to get us to do a thing about Tudors. They should, in an ideal world, in a colorblind world, in a universal world, they would, but they don't. So then when the Caribbean thing comes on, then yes, you get pushback. But and it comes out in this way of like, well, you're appropriating my culture, which is misplaced. But I think that a lot of that comes from where the resources are and who gets to tell stories.
Aren't we talking about exploitation and not appropriation?
I'm talking about exclusion, actually, really.
Yeah, Miri Baraka, the great African-American poet and critic, was a black nationalist in the 60s, became a Marxist in the 70s and 80s. He was once discussing this on a radio show, and he made the point that if you tell me that the Beatles learned all they know from Blind Willie Johnson, the question I would want to ask, he said, is why is Blind Willie Johnson still running an elevator in Jackson, Mississippi? He says that's the real problem, not the fact that the Beatles may have learned what they know from him. And that's right, because in a sense, what we're talking about here is it is an unequal playing field. It's an unequal playing field because we have an unequal society. And talking about cultural appropriation isn't going to make it any more equal. Preventing Elvis from using gospel or blues in the 50s would not have got rid of Jim Crow. Nor would a similar kind of thing, preventing someone like Dana Schutz, who you may know the story, you may know she was a painter who painted Emmett Till, the 14-year-old boy who was brutally butchered and killed in 50s America.
Was there a problem, Kenan, with her installation in New York of Emmett Till?
No.
There was not?
No. I mean, it was a lousy painting,
Yes.
but that's a different matter.
Exactly.
The point is that what happens if you say somebody like like Dana Schutz cannot depict black pain, is that you're cutting out the possibilities of radical sympathy across boundaries. And I'd also ask, why is it that middle-class African Americans can talk about working-class Black Americans, but isn't that also a form of cultural appropriation, something that we never ask, which goes back to your questions about class? Can I just briefly say something about both colourblindness and Suella Braverman? I think the problem with colourblindness is that colourblindness and racism blindness get confused. And colourblindness has become a form of racism blindness, or the argument for colourblindness has become a form of racism blindness, as we can see in France most clearly. And that's the issue. Secondly, on Suella Braverman, Gary, you raised the point that shouldn't her experiences have shaped the way she thinks? Yeah. Well,
or isn't it reasonable to ask?
Yeah, sure. But her experiences is also that of her class, her education. And the problem with much of this debate is that we reduce what are people's experiences to one dimension and say, the only thing we see when we see Suella Braverman is she's of Asian descent and of migrants. And that seems to be a really poor way of understanding not just Suella Braverman, but all our minorities, to see us only in terms of one dimension. Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of the UK, and the First Minister in Scotland are also both Asian. Everybody talks about that. What they don't say is that they're both privately educated. Has that got something to do with the fact that both have risen to the top of politics? And so that's the second problem with this, which is that in viewing these issues simply through the lens of race and identity, all the other issues, including class, that play such an important role in shaping politics and in shaping the lives of minorities, because the majority of minority communities are working class. We should never forget that. And therefore, to ignore the question of class when we're talking about race is actually to ignore the aspirations and experiences of the majority of Black and Asian people.
So we have around 15 minutes. Let's try to get a bunch of questions, comments in, please. Yes, right there.
On the theme of enlightenment and the issue about racism, I think that are we not like in a little bit of a religious phase on racism, LGBTQ issues and so forth? If somebody would accuse me, you're a racist, and not only me, but I'm coming from Sweden, we have a very right-wing party there, and they're anti-racist, very surprisingly, since they kind of stem from some neo-Nazi party that was before. But they feel that they have to make the point that they're anti-racist. And the first reaction that most people are having is to deny it. I'm not racist, or I'm not homophobic. But without any clear definition among the two people who are discussing this, what is your definition of racism? And my question is, are we not in that phase that it's such a heavy axiom that it's no space for really discussing? If you're accusing me of being a racist, then I would like to know what is your definition. But if you would ask that question, you would be perceived as even more of a racist.
Excellent. Let's take a few more questions if we can. Yes, please. Or just go to someone with a question. Please.
So I'm asking myself, I also see that identity politics have reached, I don't know, their limits in a way, but they're also an answer to something because it didn't work before as well. You laid that out. The ideology of modernity, also der Moderne, it didn't work, of enlightenment, right? Like the concepts of enlightenment, they didn't work. It wasn't just. So post-modernity, is this the word?
Yes, yes,
yeah,
yes.
Thank you, is an answer to that. So I'm questioning myself now, where do we go from here? What could be a vision of the future who doesn't stop at this identity politics? And I also found a bit of an answer. As you laid it out before, you said identity is good to start, but it's not a good way to finish. So I wanted to hear something from
Brilliant, thank you. We could take just two more. The young man in the front.
You said young.
Soon after Boris Johnson published his book on Churchill, Shashi Tharoor published a book on Churchill. Shashi Tharoor is former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, former cabinet minister in India, and an acknowledged novelist as well. The coverage of Johnson's book in the British media was sort of, cover to cover. It was everywhere. It sold a lot of copies, had a big advance for it. It was very difficult to find any reviews of Tharoor's book, which looked at Churchill's record in the colonies and in the First World War, and the mobilization of the colonies for the First World War, then later on in the Second World War as well. And what struck me about that was that it was not to do with individual responses to issues of race. It was an entire industry of publishing and media and celebrity, which ensured that the dominant narrative was a book of virtually zero intellectual value over that which was actually raising very important questions which you virtually never hear about when Churchill is discussed in the United Kingdom. So to what extent do we have to address structural issues like that, as well as one's own individual responses?
Let's start with these three. Thank you, Misha.
So to the first question, I think that one of the challenges that we have, and it's come out not in the way that I think that we've been talking about it, but in some of the issues we've raised, is learning how to talk about race and racism, actually most forms of oppression, in an intelligent way, and in a way that is well understood. And that one thing that I think is very important when it comes, let's say, to racism, is not to have the who you are conversation. The you are a racist conversation ends nowhere, because you're talking about a person's motivation, their inside. It's what people do. And so you have to have what you have done, what you have said. You have to be able to point to the thing and say, this is the thing, this is the problem. This is what we're talking about. Otherwise, you're talking about somebody's moral character, and there is no, first of all, there's no way to win that conversation, and secondly, unless you're, I don't know, the Pope, you don't get to talk about people's moral character. So what you did, you have to talk about what people did and what they said. Your point, Misha, I think that, and this speaks to the last point that you made, Kenan, about Suella Braverman, is that none of these things work alone. The sexism, the nationalism, the racism, they are all working with a host of other rogue characters that may aggravate it, may mitigate it, the celebrity, the class, there are a bunch of things in any given moment that give something its meaning. And if you're not talking about these things in context, you're not talking about them intelligently. And the last point I would make to the young woman, and I don't want to, I may here just be hinging on a term. It may be, I don't think that identity, that the politics driven by identity, I don't think it has run its course. If we look at what happened in 2020 with Black Lives Matter, a lot changed in terms of people's opinions and attitudes. If you look at the level of inequalities that we have, then people, so long as people are oppressed on the basis of their identities, then there will be a rallying around those identities. So I think we've still got a way to go. I don't think we're done.
Thanks, Gary. Susan, Kenan.
So very quickly, I don't think racism is that hard to define. I think it is reducing people to what you think is their racial or ethnic identity and expecting certain things because of them. And I don't think that's complicated. Is racism and other forms of oppression structural? Absolutely. And yes, of course we need to do things, and I do think that things have changed somewhat since 2020, 2019, even before that. I think we are thinking more carefully about what gets published, what gets produced, what kinds of cultural production. So I think we're beginning to think about systemic oppression, and we need to do more. I have to, gosh, I don't want to be patronizing, but when you say the Enlightenment didn't work, I have to ask you, I mean, do you believe in equality before the law, for example? Of course we don't always have it. Rich people, pay for expensive lawyers and often get off the hook. But do you think that's unjust, and do you think that justice systems need to work against it? That's an Enlightenment idea. I can come up with, I would be the last person to deny the existence of racism and sexism and homophobia in, I could actually, if I wanted to, go on about it for a very long time. And nevertheless, on the basis of principles of universal justice. I have seen changes in my lifetime. I mean, I grew up at a time when I couldn't swim in a lake with black children, when women weren't, silly things like allowed to wear pants in various places, but also not allowed to consider that they might have serious careers and families at the same time. It was really, really dicey. I grew up at a time when to get out of the Vietnam War, to get out of being drafted, all you had to do was pretend to be gay and go in with some kind of exaggerated caricature of what were thought to be gay, gestures. And everybody knew that. There was an Arlo Guthrie song. Everybody knew that that was the case. And yet, I don't know a single man who was ready to pretend to be gay for 15 minutes in front of his draft board because he was afraid of being marked for life as somebody who really was gay. Well, now we have gay marriage in, what were quite conservative countries. So, all of those, I would argue, are Enlightenment principles that the Enlightenment, or progress based on Enlightenment principles that the Enlightenment did not realize itself, but that it's up for the rest of us to do.
Okay, the Enlightenment is dead. Long live the Enlightenment. Kenan.
I agree. I think the idea that the Enlightenment hasn't worked leads me to ask, would we really want to live in a pre-Enlightenment world?
Exactly.
But at the same time, you're right, that those ideals have not been realized, and that's an issue. But the other side of it is that when you talk about identity politics as a response to the failure of the Enlightenment, identity politics have been here for a very long time. If you look at anti-racist, anti-colonial movements, there were always identitarian strains within them. The Back to Africa movement in the 19th century, Garveyism, negritude, Pan-Africanism, they were all identitarian movements. But they were relatively marginal movements. I mean, there were moments when Garveyism, for example, around the First World War, became a major. Pan-Africanism around the Second World War. But they were relatively minor because the great struggles to transform the world, the anti-colonial struggle, the struggle for women's rights, the struggle for gay rights, and so on, all those struggles were rooted in belief in universality, of universal rights. So what has changed is not that identity politics has suddenly appeared. It has become suddenly the dominant force within those kinds of struggles. So the question to ask is why? And it seems to me that the reason is that a universalist perspective requires us to have political optimism, to believe that one can transform society, one can overcome the fissures of race and identity. An identitarian position is largely the product of pessimism about the possibilities of doing that. And it seems to me that what has changed over the past 50, 60 years is precisely the rise of what I'd call social pessimism, the decline of those old social movements for change, the erosion of the power of working class movements, the destruction of trade unions, and so on. Those kinds of movements, those kinds of changes have made people cling ever more to their kind of narrow identities as almost like a kind of refuge, and then it becomes the only way to look at see the world. If you look at something like critical race theory, now there's been a lot said about critical race theory. Most of it is pretty abysmal. But the one thing that I think people forget about something like critical race theory is it's a product of social pessimism. Derek Bell, who was the founder one of the founders of critical race theory, a really important figure, really influential figure, who started as a lawyer in the push to desegregate the South in the 50s and 60s, became deeply disillusioned with the prospect of doing that because it had changed the lives of African Americans. It had, but in a kind of in a transformative terms. And his view was that racism is ineradicable, that it will always be there, that it cannot be challenged, but that we have to continue fighting racism, even though at the same time as recognizing that it can't be challenged. And if you look at somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates, the kind of possibly the most influential African-American essayist at the moment, he draws on that idea that racism for him is like a typhoon or an earthquake. And just like a natural disaster, and just like a typhoon and an earthquake cannot be stopped by a law or by a social movement, neither, he believes, can racism. And so what has driven identity politics is actually that sense of pessimism about the possibilities of social change. And of course, if if you're fighting against something which you believe cannot be overcome, then the very nature of your struggle changes. So anti-racism has shifted from being a struggle for material change to being a struggle for representational or symbolic change. Not that either of those are unimportant, but once they become the features of one's movement, the whole movement transforms. And kind of the material change that anti-racism used to be about has become taken second place. That, to me, seems to be the problem.
Kenan, you have my vote. That was brilliant. Last words, and then we're going to have to conclude. Susan and Gary.
So I agree with Kenan. You have my vote too. And one of the things that I liked about your book is that you were not afraid to talk about some of the achievements and some of the things that we know that we owe Communist Party and socialism. I should say I'm not now, nor have I ever been a member of the Communist Party. I've never actually been a member of any party, though I sometimes work for the German Social Democrats. But I think we're living in an age which is worse in many ways than McCarthyism. Because during McCarthyism, everybody knew a communist, or at least a socialist. It wasn't a kind of monstrous concept that, oh, well, you know, it leads straight to the gulag, all right? What caused the pessimism on the left? 1991. I'm not saying that a lot of good things happened in 1991, but it was also the collapse of real existing socialism that, however problematic the real existence was based on an idea of universal justice, okay? And the left fell apart. And rather than being able to say, well, gosh, you know, just like there are many forms of capitalism, there could be many forms of socialism. How did we get it wrong? You know, what should we do? Next round, I think that's the point at which people resign themselves to tribal identities and very small projects, because the idea of an international project of universal justice seemed like, you know, you go for that and all you get is the gulag. And that's just wrong. One of the things that I like about your book is that you dare, I'm wondering how your trip to the States will be, you actually dare to point out, for example, you know, that without the Communist Party, the Scottsboro Boys would have all been dead. And of course, the Scottsboro Boys were the first time we heard the word woke. So,
Susan, thank you. Thank you for that. Gary.
I'm just not sure I'm as pessimistic as you, or maybe I'm not sure that it's only pessimism, or primarily pessimism, driving a lot of this. First of all, if I look around at, and here sexual orientation is a very good example, something that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago, that I was in rural Ireland just last week, and a woman who works in a care home was just casually talked about her wife. 20 years ago, that would have been unthinkable.
exactly.
That is a distance that has been traveled. And if I think about one of the primary organizing issues at the moment, it's the environment. Now, of course, there's an awful lot of eco-pessimism, but that's large numbers of people rallying to save the planet, not their race, not their country, the planet. And increasingly, people are talking and thinking in planetary terms, which is actually as diametrically opposed to identitarianism as you can get. And even in those areas that may appear like silos, let's take race here. In Britain, in much of Europe, actually, when it came to the big demonstrations of Black Lives Matter, most of the people on them were white. That there is a kind of, so I think there is considerable potential, and that doesn't mean there is a lot of essentialism that I find deeply troubling. But the thing I find most troubling about identity politics is actually its employment by the right. The stuff that mostly we've been talking about, it irritates and it hampers, it can disable us at times from acting. But the stuff on the right is killing people.
Just look at DeSantis.
Yeah, I mean, they're banning books, they're buying flags, they're flying people to Rwanda, refugees to Rwanda. They are refusing to save people who are drowning, all on the basis of identity. They're coming here to take what's ours is never defined, to take what's ours, to ruin our culture, and so on and so forth. And so when it comes to like the thing I'm most worried about proportionately in terms of identity politics, it's that.
Gary Young, Susan, NEIMAN, KENAN MALIK, you have tackled some of the thorniest cultural and political questions of our time with such decency and equipoise and seriousness and aplomb. I think all we can do is thank you so much for your brilliant words.